Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rumi Forum. Today I'm moderating a special presentation with Dr. David Smock of the United States Institute for Peace. I'm Father Francis Tizo from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops up in Northeast Washington. We're still within the Beltway. We don't hang over the edge. And I work with interreligious relations for the Catholic bishops here in the United States. Dr. Smock is Vice President of the USIP and Director of the Religion and Peacemaking Program. He holds a Ph.D. in anthropology and a Master of Divinity degree. He's author of 10 books. Some of his recent work has been the article on Islamic peacemaking since 9/11, which can be found on the usip.org website. He's also written a book, Managing a Mediation Process, published in 2008, and Interfaith Dialogue and Peace Building, published in 2004. Let's welcome Dr. Smock.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you and back at the Rumi Forum. Always happy to participate in events organized by the Rumi Forum. Those of you who are not well versed in the activities of the Rumi Forum should educate yourselves, because it's a truly remarkable organization with a worldwide reach of very important activities around the world. I want to do a couple of rather simple things today. One, to talk about the degree to which religion is or is not a significant factor in international conflict, and then to talk about the flip side of that and talk about how religion can and does contribute to peacemaking in various parts of the world. You're all aware that religion gets blamed for all kinds of atrocities around the world, and that some people arguing that religion and religious differences are the most important factor in contributing to international conflict. It's important to keep in perspective the degree to which what's called religious conflict really is religious or is not religious. So many times, by way of shorthand, there are descriptions of conflicts as being between Christians and Muslims, or Muslims and Jews, or Buddhists and Hindus, when in fact they're not disputes over religion at all. It may be that the people who are in conflict with each other may be differentiated by religious identity, but it isn't religion that is the source of their conflict or disagreement. Among the countries that I've been very actively involved in are Sudan and Nigeria, and particularly in the Sudanese context, when the war was going on between North and South, it was described as a war between Christians and Muslims. But in fact, the North and South are differentiated by so many different things. It does happen that most of the people in the North are Muslim and most of the people in the South, or a significant proportion of people in the South, are Christians. But there are racial differences, there are language differences, there are ethnic differences, there are occupational and class differences, there are differences in geography and regional differences. As I say, all these differences do happen to overlap with religious differentiation, but it isn't that the arguments and disagreements are so much about religion per se. I remember hearing about a Presbyterian pastor who showed up one Sunday morning at church in southern Sudan, and there were 500 people there saying they wanted to convert to Christianity. And he started asking them questions, trying to find out whether this is while the civil war was going on between North and South. Asked them why they wanted to convert, what had led them to come to this decision, and virtually none of them knew anything about Christianity or were prepared to make a really religious commitment. But to be a Christian was to identify yourself as being opposed to the North, the Muslim North. So it was a matter of identity for them rather than religious conviction, and this is often the way religion plays a role in conflict or in differentiating people. In Nigeria, where I've been involved and active for many years, and particularly conflict between Muslims and Christians in the Plateau State, which is the area that's between the north and south, and the population is about equally divided between Muslims and Christians. And the conflicts, very bloody conflicts, several thousand people have been killed in clashes in recent years. And I've been involved in a particular area called Yelwa, and 1,000 people were killed there in 2004, mostly Muslims being killed by Christians. But if you go and you ask the people of Yelwa, what are the disputes about? Rarely do they touch on anything that's religious in character. The two groups are differentiated by ethnic identity, whether the people are indigenous to that area or whether they're recent migrants. They're differentiated by class. The Muslims tend to be more wealthy than the Christians. By occupation, the Muslims tend to be either pastoralists or traders, and the Christians agriculturalists. So a whole range of differences that really generate the sources of the conflict. But in shorthand terms, the conflict is described as between Christians and Muslims. To look at Iraq, I mean, you talk about the three principal population groups in Iraq: Shia, Sunni, and Kurd. Well, Kurdish identity is an ethnic identity. The other two are religious identities, but the differences operate in much the same way. The conflicts are not so much over theology or religious practice, but rather social identity and social differentiation. It just happens that the religious difference is the basis for the differentiation and identity between the Sunnis and Shias, but the difference with the Kurds is an ethnic identity and a language difference. All by way of saying that there are situations where religion does come into play. In Somalia now, the conflict that's going on, although it has other sources as well, is largely over what brand of Islam will predominate in Somalia. So there are real religious differences operating there and generating the conflict. In the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine conflict, not primarily a religious conflict at all, but there are real conflicts over control of the holy sites. There are things where religion is the source of the conflict. But all by way of saying the role of religion as a source of conflict internationally, I would argue, is grossly exaggerated. And we need to disaggregate what are the sources of conflict and try to understand the degree to which religion is or is not a significant factor in those conflicts. But I want to give the bulk of my attention to religion as a source of peacemaking. I think we're all aware of situations in which religious leaders have fought for justice, for reconciling people to each other, for resolution of conflict, for peacemaking. The church's role in South Africa is a notable example in the struggle against apartheid. While it wasn't a religious movement per se, but religious leaders were prominent in the leadership of that struggle. You all know about the role that the Buddhist monks played in Burma recently in the street demonstrations objecting to the repressive regime that controls Burma. And we can cite other examples around the world where religious leaders have been really important players in struggles for justice. But there are many examples as well where religious leaders have played important roles in peacemaking. In the summer of 2001, I was contacted by Rabbi Menachem Froman he's actually a settler in the West Bank and an Orthodox rabbi, and the late Sheikh Talal Sider, who was in the Palestinian cabinet at the time, representing the religious communities. And they wanted to come to Washington to sign a religious declaration of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. It didn't happen because Ariel Sharon wouldn't allow the chief rabbi of Israel to come here to take part in this, and because the State Department was not prepared to give a visa to Talal Seder, even though he was a peacemaker. He'd had a background in the Muslim Brotherhood, and so his reputation was tainted for life, even though he'd become a peacemaker. But then the Archbishop of Canterbury got involved, and they were able to hold a meeting in Alexandria, Egypt in January of 2002 to bring together all the top rabbis, Christian leaders from the Palestinian community, and leaders from the Muslim community among the Palestinians. And they signed the Alexandria Declaration, which is a very important statement by religious leaders from all three Abrahamic faiths in Israel and Palestine to declare themselves for peace, to establish what was anticipated to be a religious track for peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Unfortunately, as we know, there was never a political track that really got off the ground from 2002 until the present, so the religious track wasn't able to be supportive of the way that it had anticipated. But we were involved over several years following the signing of the Alexandria Declaration, providing the principal financial support for Christian, Muslim, and Jewish leaders to meet on a monthly basis to talk about shared interests in promoting peace between Israel and the Palestinian territories. I mentioned the work that we had done in the Plateau State in Nigeria, and our partners there are two remarkable Nigerians, one Pastor James Uwe, an evangelical pastor, Pentecostal pastor, and a conservative Muslim imam, Imam Ashafa, both of who have been in Washington this last week, and you may have encountered them. They spoke twice at a conference at Georgetown. But we worked together in Yalwa, this community where 1,000 people had been killed. And they have remarkable capability of using a combination of religious exhortation, of Western conflict resolution techniques, of traditional Nigerian conflict resolution techniques to become effective peacemakers. And we were able to work out a peace agreement in Yalwa between the Christian and Muslim communities that's held from 2004 until the present. And we're currently supporting their work in Jos, where somewhere between 600 and 1,000 people were killed just last November between Muslims and Christians. But a remarkable story of two people who had both come from warrior backgrounds. James lost his right arm in fighting against Muslims. Ashafa had two of his cousins killed in fighting, and they had been leading respectively Christian militias and Muslim militias fighting each other, and they were sworn enemies. They wanted to kill each other. And yet, through a series of epiphanies and transpersonal transformations, they came to realize that Christianity and Islam are both religions of peace rather than war, and they joined together to establish the Interfaith Mediation Center in Kaduna, Nigeria. And they've been making peace ever since. We helped sponsor a film called The Pastor and Imam, which is a remarkable film, and now we're sponsoring a DVD that focuses on their methodology. Just parenthetically, we have been active in religious peacemaking in Iraq as well, and one of the recent workshops that we held with Iraqi religious leaders and civil leaders talking about interfaith dialogue and religious peacemaking. We didn't think the Iraqis would really respond to a Nigerian film, but just on a chance that it might have an impact, why we showed The Pastor and Imam and film. And it had a profound impact on the Iraqis, and several of the participants ended up in tears, just moved by the stories of these two Nigerians, their own stories of reconciliation and stories of personal transformation and of their peacemaking activities. And in fact, we've used Institute money recently to buy 1,000 copies of the Arabic version of this film to distribute throughout Iraq because it had such a deep impact on the participants in our workshop. We have confidence that it's going to be an effective film more broadly in Iraq. And I could tell stories about work in Sri Lanka and elsewhere where we're working with different religious communities on an interfaith basis to make peace. Usually in places where religion is one of the factors, one of the sources of conflict. Although some other places like Colombia, where we're working with religious leaders, religion is not a factor in the conflict at all there, but nevertheless religious leaders have important roles to play in peacemaking. I just wanted to mention as well interfaith dialogue as another mechanism for making peace across lines of religious division. And of course Rumi is the past masters of interfaith dialogue and reaching across religious boundaries. Particularly since 9/11, Muslim leaders around the world have been very proactive in reaching out, particularly to Christians and Jews, to engage in interfaith dialogue, to point out the similarities between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Probably the most important initiative of this kind is called the Common Word, which originated with Prince Ghazi in Jordan and is a declaration pointing out the similarities between Islam and Christianity, signed by Muslim leaders from around the world endorsing it. And after the Common Word was issued, it was a very important conference organized at Yale Divinity School last spring. There'll be one coming up at Georgetown this fall. The Pope invited representatives from the Common Word to come to the Vatican to engage in dialogue based upon the Common Word, a very important document that has generated a lot of interest and a lot of discussion. We have been tasked by Prince Ghazi to develop manuals for use in local congregations to enable Christians and Muslims to engage in dialogue in a meaningful fashion. And we're working to develop these manuals, which will be widely disseminated in congregations. Another remarkable initiative was that the Union of Reform Judaism and ISNA, the largest Muslim organization in this country, have developed a curriculum for interfaith dialogue between Jews and Muslims. Quite a remarkable initiative that's had an impact in this country and in widening circles for Jewish-Muslim dialogue. Finally, I want to mention one experience that I had that pointed out that sometimes the most difficult, what you might anticipate would be the most difficult kind of dialogue, can turn out to be the most productive. I've been working over a several-year period to try to convince the Saudi government that they should invite an American delegation composed of Jewish rabbis, of Muslim imams, and Christian clergy to come to Saudi Arabia and engage in dialogue with Saudi religious leaders. The Saudis have no problem with the Christians and the Muslims, but they do get nervous about inviting a delegation of rabbis to come to Saudi Arabia. So after I had proposed this to the Saudi government, they said, well, let's start with a reverse delegation. Why don't we send a delegation of Saudi religious leaders to the States, and you organize a program for them for interfaith dialogue. And I said, I will agree to do that on the condition that I have total control over who they meet and total control over the agenda that we are to discuss. So the Saudis agreed to this. So the delegation of 5 religious scholars came. We had a day-long meeting with Christian leaders. We had a day-long meeting with Muslim leaders and a day-long meeting with Jewish leaders, mostly Orthodox rabbis. The Christians and the Muslims worked so hard to establish their common humanity with the Saudis that they never really got down to the difficult and divisive issues. The Orthodox rabbis had no difficulty getting down to the divisive issues. But it was a remarkable conversation because both sides confronted each other with what was on their minds and hearts and what they saw the significant differences to be. Both sides were completely respectful toward the other. The Saudis wanted to know, can we be critical of the policies of the Israeli government without being charged with anti-Semitism? The rabbis wanted to know, are the Saudis prepared to accept a Jewish state in the Middle East? And we went back and forth on these issues, but it was a remarkably productive day of deep soul searching. And the two groups didn't come away totally convinced of the other's point of view, but they at least understood the other's point of view much more deeply and effectively and provided a basis for ongoing dialogue. So I will stop there, and I don't know whether you have any comments or questions you want to add, or whether you're going to open it up. But
this has really been very, very helpful because, as we said just before we got here, one of the problems is that the whole question is a subtle one. There are many different influences on society and on political actions that are taken. Now, one of the things that came to my mind as you were talking about the situation in, let's say, Nigeria or in Sudan was the thought that possibly people identify with opposing, or presumably opposing, religious groups in the hope of getting support from outside the country that they're in, thinking that a Christian government will notice if we as Christians are in trouble, or vice versa. I noticed in northern Nepal, when I was doing field work up there in 97 and 2000, that people from the Terai, the lowlands on the border with India, had come up into the highlands and were creating ecological chaos, cultural problems, and all kinds of other things. But the local Buddhist leadership, the lamas were mostly of Vajrayana-type Himalayan Buddhism, were being very, very patient with the situation. They had no one to turn to, and they were trying to maintain peaceful relations with this new and really disoriented population. And one could imagine a Hindu-Buddhist conflict there, but it didn't happen. Something of this, it's quite in contrast with the Tamil and Sinhala conflict in Sri Lanka. Could it be that there's always this hope that someone from outside will notice us, and that that's really one of the political factors that contributes to social destabilization, and that the religion is simply a tag, in other words?
that hasn't been my experience in the places where I've worked. I don't think it's a significant factor in either Sudan or Nigeria. I'm sure there are individual conversions where people think they will get assistance from the religious community. But whether or not they think they're going to get international recognition and support, I haven't seen much of that.
And yet, of course, this whole question of arms shipments through Kenya to southern Sudan. So something's going on, and apparently things are heating up there. So it's coming from outside somewhere.
Well, those arms shipments, things are heating up in a very worrying fashion. I mean, Darfur is not the only part of Sudan that's problematic. I don't know for a fact, but I would expect that the arms shipments that the pirates captured were actually paid for by the southern Sudan government. You know, there is, I'll flip your question around the other way. A great deal of the interest in Darfur and earlier in the North-South conflict in Sudan came from evangelical Christians in this country because of their concern about Christians in the South. And there was a lot of rhetoric, a lot of it exaggerated, about the Islamization of the South, of forced conversions of Christians by Muslims. And the evangelical community here became quite outraged at the threats to the Christian community in the South. And the original interest was generated in the North-South conflict, but then that interest was also transferred to Darfur, even though there are virtually no Christians in Darfur at all. It was an interest in, and the interest in Darfur goes well beyond the evangelical community, but they were among the first to really be really concerned about it and strong advocates. And interestingly enough, the Jewish community in this country also became very active on the Darfur. You mentioned the word genocide, and that triggers concerns about the Holocaust, and any situation where a whole people looks like it's under threat is going to generate an outcry of concern from the Jewish community in this country. So there are international connections, but I think it's more from us to them rather than from them to us.
That's very, very important. Because that means that then what we do in this country and in Europe and so forth can have an impact on re-stabilization in some of these areas.
Yes. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the guests today? You and you? Okay. Please.
How you doing? Thank you for allowing me to attend this briefing. My name is Paul. I'm from Virginia. Question I have for either one is if we have hypothetically a global religious war take place between basically the Christians and, say, the Muslims, is there any mechanism or any form that exists right now for trying to bring that under control, to tame down the radicals, or however you want to call it?
Well, I think your question is highly hypothetical, and I don't think it's
I'm retired military, and I can give you many scenarios.
a worldwide conflict between Christians and Muslims.
Sure. For example, if the Vatican was threatened by a Muslim group, and in retaliation, the Christians or the Catholics retaliated by attacking Mecca, that would definitely spark global interest.
Well, I just can't imagine that. The Vatican's not going to attack Mecca.
I'm not saying the Vatican, but I did say Catholics.
Well, leaving your hypothetical question aside, let me try to respond to what you're talking about in terms of what kind of response might be appropriate. One of the things the United Nations has agonized over is how the UN should relate to religious communities around the world. And there have been, I think, 3 different rather abortive efforts to develop, in one case, a set of religious mediators who could be called upon when there are conflicts, particularly conflicts that have religious overtones. And there have been 2 other instances where the UN has called religious leaders together, or at least if that hasn't been officially in the name of the UN, at least they've co-sponsored or they have been supportive of the effort. But as I said, these have been abortive efforts. It makes I think there's an area that can be cultivated and worked on there, but it makes secular governments very nervous to engage religious leaders, to point to religious leaders as prospective mediators, so that, in response to your question, I think that would be the most effective mechanism for the UN to be involved and for religious leaders on an interfaith basis to be heavily involved in tamping down conflict and mediating between differences. But so far the UN has had great difficulty in working out a modus operandi by which they could collaborate with religious leaders. But I don't know whether you have any.
This is very,
thoughts on it?
very interesting, both question and answer. The Holy See has always pointed toward the United Nations as the instrument for dealing with these kinds of problems. So the policy is pretty strong on that an international organization has to be the primary mediating instrument. Because, of course, the reason, I don't know why the exact details are for why those attempts were abortive, but part of the problem I can easily imagine would be the fact that actual political authority and power is not usually shared, at least in most countries around the world, with any kind of religious bodies. All right? Now, we mostly have secular models of governments. Even in majority Muslim countries, there is a prevailing tendency to identify the government as distinct from, even if linked to, the mufti or some other structure within the country. So there's a distinction there. So it's a very important thing to work with secular political power and its authority, and the best way to do that is through the UN. And our organizations will primarily work in the NGO world, with getting together different religious non-governmental organizations, interreligious non-governmental organizations, and so forth, to try to bring people together. But the real challenge that you're raising is, suppose there was some explosive event, what would you do, to whom you would turn? And there I think that, again, because some of these things like the common word between us and some of the other initiatives that have emerged over the years, and even the dialogues that we have going here in the United States on an annual basis, provide us now with leadership that knows each other, okay? Leadership on several sides, that are familiar with one another, that know one another's modus operandi, vision for the future, way of making peace and doing conflict resolution. Those people exist and are known to one another. So the UN at some point could very easily, or other organizations could very easily, draw on those persons. And almost at this point, we've almost got institutionalized dialogues out there. The book that you described, Children of Abraham, that ISNA and the Union of Reform Judaism put together, is only one example of an almost thoroughly institutionalized relationship between Reform Judaism and Islam in this country. Our 3 dialogues are practically permanent at this point: the West Coast, Midwest, and Mid-Atlantic dialogues. So that, again, people know one another and could quickly come together. And in fact, one of the themes that I brought into every one of the dialogues over the past few years has been precisely this. In the time of a crisis, a tragedy, a challenge of some kind, we are available, and we must make ourselves known as being available to engage in conflict resolution quickly. And I've been trying to get the Holy See also to work with this, and part of the last November meeting was to bring in people from the United States who have been on our dialogues to participate in the common word discussion. And you had a question.
I'm a lawyer, and I've done a lot of mediation in law and have a strong interest in affiliation with also a conflict resolution organization here in town. From what I know, and I'm not the expert, if you could correct me if I'm wrong, Father, theologically Christianity has absolutely no basis whatsoever for any conflict or violence to propagate the faith. I mean, that's just antithetical and oxymoronic to Jesus as the Prince of Peace, etc. But we've heard a lot of propaganda about jihad as a Muslim tool of propagating Islam, and I'm unclear, and maybe we could get some clarification on whether that's just pure propaganda or whether that's founded or rooted religiously somehow in the teachings of the Prophet, or from the Quran or anything like that. That's the first question. And the second one is maybe Father, you could talk about the San Egidio community.
Oh, San Egidio.
Yeah,
right?
because I think and what they have done actually in the Muslim world, I'm not all clear on what it is, but I think it'd be helpful to talk
Sure.
about. Okay.
Very good. Do you want to take the jihad question?
And I can say something about San Egidio also, if you want to comment on that. I think all the major faiths have their parallel to jihad in some ways. I mean, we've had the Christian communities had the Crusades, and there have been religiously justified and authenticated militaristic movements in Christianity and Judaism and in Islam. So while I would share your interpretation of the Christian scriptures, that there's no basis in the scriptures, there are those who have misinterpreted them to justify religious warfare. The whole question of jihad is a very complicated one. There are a variety of types of jihad. Most of it is related to internal spiritual transformation. There is an element within the Islamic faith that would, if the Muslim community is attacked, there is a basis for having an armed response with a religious justification. But I'm not an expert on jihad, and I won't expound beyond what I know, but it's a very complicated subject, and there's so much superficial interpretation of jihad that flies around that I think does a disservice to the nuances of Islam. On San Egidio, we were involved with San Egidio. I mean, in some ways, their most remarkable intervention was in Algeria at the time of the elections, and I'm forgetting now what year that was, but when the Islamists won the election and the military disallowed the elections, and San Egidio called a conference in Rome that brought all the parties together. And I mean, this was such an anomaly to have a Catholic organization bring all these Muslim groups together. But they did it, and they worked out an agreement on a way forward. I think it was called the Rome Declaration that came out of that. And that was accepted by the Islamists as a basis for moving forward in Algeria. It was rejected by the Algerian military. But San Egidio has been involved in many conflict areas around the world. Mozambique, which isn't a religious conflict and doesn't have an Islamic component, but that's their most remarkable success story, where they hosted and helped orchestrate the mediation that led to the resolution of the long civil war in Mozambique. But you may want to add to the San Egidio.
One of the important things is that in addition to doing big kinds of mediation, they also have a grassroots approach. And so they are available to people on the local level, both in terms of programming and also in terms of training. And of course, it started in the 60s as a group of young people who just wanted to pray together in one of the more neglected churches of the Trastevere section of Rome. Sant'Egidio is, in fact, that church. Apparently, they've moved their programs over to the larger church of Santa Maria in Trastevere, which is a very famous historic monument. And they work a lot with immigrant communities and have done a lot in Sicily, where a lot of the people coming in from Africa and North Africa, sub-Saharan and North Africa, are received in camps, and they've been working with the immigrant community that is in considerable difficulty after they are delivered, usually, of course, illegally by traffickers, and they've been working in that area very assiduously. You know, one of the problems with your comment about jihad is very well taken. The term is so difficult because it implies both kinds of struggle, physical and interior. But also, like even the notion of crusade, is used metaphorically, right? And also it has its own history. All of these things, one of the challenges that I've tried to address in our bilateral dialogues with the Muslim groups has been to look carefully at chronology, because words change over the centuries. And as one event leads to another, terms begin to acquire a greater or lesser traction in accordance with particular definitions. And jihad, crusade, even Inquisition, which is the president used it very inappropriately in that speech in Cairo, because the Inquisition didn't even exist yet when Andalusia was in its golden age. So these kinds of things are misunderstood because people don't understand the chronology and the impact of one event upon a subsequent event and upon a subsequent way of commenting on classic texts. I think one of the great deficiencies of our understanding of all the religious conflicts down through the ages, or religious influence conflicts, has been our failure to match up chronology with ideology. And as a result, we tend to be a little sloppy. Like, take, for example, even the Crusades took place after 400 years of the existence of Islam. All right? And if you study those 400 years, you can see how territories that belonged to the former Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, were invaded by Muslim armies. So one could say that there is a question of a defensive war involved. It was a failed defensive war. But there are many ways of looking at this thing down through the centuries. Certainly it is interesting that the first reconquest of a Christian territory was probably the Italian reconquest, because the Muslims were all over southern Italy. And it was probably in the 10th century that the boot was made entirely Christian, with some exceptions in Bari and Lucera. And then under Frederick II, with his defeat, even Bari and Lucera were removed and Sicily was reconquered as well. So that the Spanish Reconquista takes place just as the Italian Reconquista is finishing. All right, so that these were thought of by the Europeans as reconquering sections of the Roman Empire that belonged to them historically and which never belonged to Arabs. Okay, it's a different historical perspective. So we have to look at those historical perspectives, the chronology, and how they parallel with the development of terminology to describe them.
Just building on that about chronology and historical interpretation, my Muslim colleague in the religion program, Kamar al-Huda, is editing a volume that we will be publishing in the next 6 or 9 months. One of the chapters is a history of jihad, of the notion of jihad, and how in different periods of Islamic history it has been interpreted and applied. And it's a fascinating story of the different interpretations at different times in history.
Any other questions?
I have
Jen.
just a comment. Just to build on that, the other important element, of course, is the element of defense, self-defense, but then there also has to be a legitimate Islamic state, which we don't have one currently today. We do not have a khalifa. So
To justify.
exactly,
Yeah, right.
to use that to justify in that, definition of jihad. I'm interested in the language that is used today in terms of talking about conflict and religion's place in conflict. I think a lot of the issue with this is people's use of language, and I would like your comments on that.
You want to say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, just in terms of, the religions are at it again, or there's conflict again between the religions. This is a very, to me, irresponsible use of language, for example. So does that give you...
And that Islam is a religion of war and conflict. And this, Father Tiso mentioned this recent publication that I did with Kamar al-Huda on Islamic peacemaking since 9/11, and it has a couple of different purposes. One is to debunk the idea that Muslim leaders around the world did not condemn 9/11, do not speak out against terrorism, and we documented very thoroughly not only political leaders from Muslim countries, but religious leaders from around the Muslim world. They don't get quoted in the Western press, but they made the statements, and so we've tried to document and show the extent to which these condemnations have been disregarded, and then the extent to which Muslim institutions and leaders have been promoting peacemaking, interfaith dialogue, and other ways of promoting peace as an expression of the fundamental tenets of Islam, to undermine the prevailing stereotype that Islam is a religion of conflict and warfare. But you're right, I mean, you get set phrases that seem to prevail, and it repeats itself again and again.
Yeah, I mean, we see violence as, sorry,
That's okay.
just a minute.
Go ahead.
I see violence as a situation, I think you do as well, and many of us do, that exists in all human beings, whether they are of a religious affiliation or not. Communism has killed many as well, for example. And that could be stated as a religion as well, but it is inherent, in the human being to have this, some would argue, this sort of tendency, possible tendency to become violent. And so to put that on to our religions, kind of scapegoating. And anyway, I appreciate your response, and interested to see how things will pan out. And I appreciate your talk, because I think this kind of talk will help to eliminate that sort of use of language. So, thanks.
Thanks, Jen. You know, actually, this whole business of tolerance and self-restraint as themes of religions, indeed, the mystical meaning of jihad implies also self-restraint, right? So that's the area where someone like myself from a pulpit can get up there and preach that. Preach about self-restraint, self-control, self-criticism, all right, as part of spiritual discipline. And that is where a subtle influence can occur in a population of people who believe there are other things too that can be done, but I want to take your questions as well.
My name is Mazen Ayubi. I appreciate your presentation. I have been part of a lot of interfaith activities in the past 30 years. And is there any effort to put this mechanism a little bit more on the positive side where it really is going to make a difference? Because those who are under occupation, let's say in the occupied territory or occupied Palestine, you have 4 or 5 million displaced people, and the Muslim world think that the Jewish state had displaced those people. And as you mentioned, the rabbis, they came, they talked to the Saudi scholars, and there's that dialogue. But before really things really go out of hand, is there any effort on the interfaith community that can really put that mechanism where it's going to be more effective, more fair and balanced, and relieve those who are under, like in Gaza and West Bank and so on? Recently, you can have a state, but you cannot have, no teeth, nothing. You cannot breathe. So, is there anything on the interfaith level that is going to be more beyond than just really talk?
Yeah, well, that's really important, and too often interfaith dialogue is confined to talk, and it doesn't go beyond that. I think the next generation of interfaith dialogue has got to move to shared action. Simple things like a service project that is engaged in by people of different faith communities and then reflected on by the participants. The Interfaith Youth Corps based in Chicago is very effective at engaging young people in service projects, and then they reflect on it from their faith traditions as a means of interfaith dialogue. And then to move beyond that to common advocacy for justice, where the different faith communities see an injustice being done and they join together to condemn it and to work to rectify it. I mean, there are some dramatic examples of, I mentioned Menachem Froman, this little hard to figure out the right adjective to use, but he's the chief rabbi of Tekoa settlement in the West Bank. Or you think of rabbis of settlements as being the most extreme right-wing radical Jewish advocates. Well, Menachem Froman was a very close friend of Yasser Arafat. In fact, I met Arafat twice before he died, and Froman took me to Arafat the first time, and they related to each other as brothers. Arafat trusted Froman so much that at one point he invited him to join the Palestinian Authority cabinet. I mean, it's just mind-blowing to think that a settlement rabbi would be so accepted, but the reason he was accepted and has been accepted and has engaged in dialogue with Hamas, he visited Sheikh Yassin when Sheikh Yassin was in prison and carried messages from Sheikh Yassin to the Israeli government, which the Israeli government didn't pick up on, and more recently Froman has been in regular touch with Hamas leaders and offered openings for the Israeli government to respond to. But the reason Froman is so widely accepted is that his belief is he wants to spend the rest of his life in Tekoa settlement. But whether the Tekoa settlement is a part of an independent Palestine or a part of Israel is basically immaterial to him. He's quite prepared to be part of a Palestinian state. He wants to maintain his Jewish identity. He wants to maintain a Jewish settlement, but he's very open to being part of a Palestinian state. So there are some remarkable people on all sides who reach across the borders and boundaries and engage in meaningful dialogue that is coming to grip with the most fundamental political issues and divisions. But it takes a lot of courage. Froman has a bodyguard. He's not being protected from Muslims, he's being protected from Jews who see him as disloyal and a threat to the Israeli state. So it's not a light thing to cross boundaries and engage in advocacy that's unpopular in your own community.
Of course, Tekoa is where Elijah was from. And so it's rather important to have a Jewish presence there, but ready to ascend on the flaming chariot. But this is a very interesting way of look, because you're the expert in conflict resolution. The conflict resolution takes place because there are people in the boundary zone. There are people on both sides of the boundary zone who know one another and are willing to work through the people in the no man's land kind of thing. This is a very interesting model. I have tried to make this case here to the church that personally knowing about the people who are leading on the other side of the table is crucial. And in fact, the whole training process, I see a lot of younger people here, the whole training process of getting people into this work of interfaith dialogue, of peacemaking, conflict resolution, requires building relationships over many decades. And that can be extremely fruitful. And eventually, you see, that builds a culture of peace. That's why also we've been emphasizing education. The notions about chronology and terminology and ideology are all related to educational concerns. Any other questions out there? Just about, yes.
That's me again. Have you been invited to the, or do you work with the Department of Defense, trying to educate the military side of it?
We get regular invitations to meet with the intelligence community, with Defense Department, and they're very interested in the religious component and understanding religion. In fact, I think we get more invitations from Defense and Intelligence than we do from the State Department in terms of understanding the religious dimensions and dynamics.
Okay. Sure. While we're waiting, any other people? Let me see your hands, okay? Well,
My name is Hashim Hassan, and I'm with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm originally from Sudan. So I'm interested in, thank you for your speech, I really enjoyed it. I'm interested about the LRA in Southern Sudan. They're based on, I think the philosophy is based on, I think, religious reasons too.
More or less.
So there is, I mean, Joseph Kony is wanted by the ICC. So
Right.
there's some kind of, whenever he's asked to come out and negotiate for peace, he's afraid that he'll be picked up and delivered to the ICC. So, but Museveni gave him amnesty. So how do you, can you elaborate on that and see how it works?
He didn't give him amnesty.
Okay, sorry.
He wants amnesty, but he hasn't been given amnesty. This is a conflict that I've been heavily involved with. Just a little over a year ago, I was in Juba when the negotiations were going on with the LRA and the Ugandan government, so I was an observer at the negotiations. Kony is for those of you who are not familiar with the Lord's Resistance Army, Kony is certifiable crazy. He says his movement is based on the Ten Commandments, and yet everything he does is contrary to the Ten Commandments. He rapes and pillages and kidnaps child soldiers and forces them to fight on his behalf. He has no real political platform. He says it's based on the Ten Commandments, but he doesn't go beyond that. It's hard to know what it's all about except for his survival and maintaining him safe from the ICC or any other prosecution. It was obvious when I was observing those negotiations that was talk about demobilization, there was talk about reconciliation, there was talk about a whole range of compensation, a whole range of issues. The elephant in the room was this very issue of amnesty and the ICC, and was never directly addressed. And that's why Coney refused to sign the agreement, because he wanted amnesty, and the Ugandan government wasn't prepared to give that to him. What the Ugandan government did want to do was to set up a separate tribunal apart from the ICC, but that would follow judicial procedures that would be acceptable to the ICC. So the ICC would accept it as an alternative means of prosecuting and judging Coney. And this seemed like a viable alternative, but the Ugandan government didn't spell out the details of what they meant by this. It wasn't at all clear that the ICC would accept the Ugandan alternative, and Coney didn't trust the Ugandan government enough to allow them to go forward, particularly because what he wanted was like actually happened in Mozambique, where the rebel leader was provided a big house and a car and a chauffeur and freedom and a place in the capital and a free life, and nobody's going to provide that to Coney. So that's where the stalemate is, and it's been very unfortunate that the Ugandan government has, well, I say unfortunate, maybe the only alternative, but turned to a military option and tried to capture Coney, and they failed in doing so. Actually, American military intelligence was supporting this effort, and they failed to capture Coney, and he then retaliated and killed 200 or 300 villagers in Congo, which is where he's hiding. It's just a terrible, nasty situation with no end in sight.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, so I mean Dante. It's always good to hear you speak, David.
Thank you.
I have kind of a psychological interest in religion and also peacemaking.
Mm-hmm.
And when you begin to talk about an apocalyptic type of consciousness, people either who try to create that by, I think the gentleman said, blowing up the Kaaba would be a perfect way of trying to create that consciousness on a global
Mhm.
level. And of course, after 9/11, I think if you would ask many people, or a good many people, if what they thought was happening, it would have been apocalyptic. I think that was a general feeling, at least while people were being traumatized. Maybe especially here in Washington, I think it was with the anthrax and the sniper in the wake of that. Now I'm wondering, in that mindset, all sorts of atrocities can happen. How do you de-escalate people back from that point? Because I feel in some ways we have moved back from that
Mhm.
kind of collective consciousness to more of an even keel. What is your thinking about how to de-escalate from that?
Well, it was an apocalyptic era, but that was just playing into the hands of Osama bin Laden. I mean, that's exactly what he wanted in perpetrating 9/11, was an apocalypse, or at least the impression that he could perpetrate an apocalypse. So we were playing into the strategy rather than fighting against the strategy. I think the fact that, I mean, mentioning again this paper that we wrote about the condemnation of 9/11 by Muslim leaders around the world, I think that if there had been a wider awareness that the vast majority of Muslims and Muslim leaders around the world were strongly opposed to what happened and strongly opposed to the warped religious interpretations of Osama bin Laden, that would have helped. I think insofar as we can publicize this and people can be aware of it, aware that the Osama bin Laden interpretation of Islam is a fringe and not mainstream, and a misreading of the main tenets of Islam. I think what was so scary was all of a sudden among the uninformed to think, oh, this is mainstream Islam that's attacking us and we're under threat from the whole of the Muslim world, and Osama bin Laden speaks for Muslims around the world. any effort, any effective effort we could have made. And President Bush did try, not terribly effectively, but he tried to say, oh, Islam is a religion of peace, and this is just fringe. But I think that's the way to counter the apocalyptic kind of mentality and atmosphere that Osama bin Laden really succeeded in creating.
So I wonder too, it's like when you don't feel a sense of legitimacy or hope
Yeah.
in this world, if you begin to look to another world, that makes things like suicide bombings and other things of that nature much more possible. Because if people are marginalized, they will not feel there is something in that central for economically
Yeah.
marginalized,
Yeah.
religiously, politically.
And that goes for terrorism beyond Islam, too. I'm probably the guy that shot the abortion doctor thought he was going to have a life in heaven for his reward for killing a person he thought was a baby killer. I mean, there's again, the apocalyptic interpretation of your religious convictions and afterlife and rewards and so on.
Other questions? Would we like to conclude? Okay, this has been a very, very intense and profound discussion, and very grateful to your contributions, and of course to Dr. Smock for being here with Rumi Forum, and I consider it a great honor. This is going to be one of my final public appearances here in Washington. It's been a great joy and an honor to help Rumi Forum in various ways of the past 5 years. You have been a wonderful host and friend, Ali Yurtsever, my good friend, my mathematician friend, who's going off to Dubai. But this is wonderful, and I hope that this relationship between USIP and Rumi Forum continues, and also that this message goes out, because it is a richly complex message, one that addresses the intelligence of the viewers, which is something rare in our time. Thank you.